Streets of Rage versus Final Fight. Which one was better? And with that particular question in mind, between these two legends, because that's what they are, they're legends. Street of Rage and Final Fight. Final Fight debuted in 1989 in arcade, and it was an instant smash hit for Capcom, the developer. And Capcom, absolutely legendary game company that have had some legendary titles. It's my personal favorite gaming company of all time. When you think of not only Final Fight, you think of Mega Man, you think of Street Fighter, and of course my personal favorite series of all time, which is Resident Evil. Just absolutely legendary stuff here with what they've done with the gaming industry. Just absolutely legendary. And the first thing that comes to mind when it comes to these two things that you have to take into account, because both of them are so iconic, they're both legendary titles, very super successful titles, hence them having multiple sequels after their original counterparts. When you ask yourself that question of which one was better, it really comes down to personal preference. But for me, it's an entire different, I would almost say, flaw when you take into account the home console war back then of Super Nintendo versus Sega Genesis. And as I might have already said, Streets of Rage was basically the answer to Final Fight, because Final Fight was exclusive to the Super Nintendo, and Genesis didn't have a similar game like Final Fight on the on the Sega Genesis. Not to the success that Final Fight was, but the thing that really separates the two for me personally is the ability to call in special attacks for Streets of Rage, that you just saw right there, where the cop car comes in and bombs away on your enemies. Like, that was really, really freaking cool back then. And Final Fight didn't have anything like that. But the number one thing that was the standout for me was the glaring omission of my favorite fighter from Final Fight, which was Guy. Guy was missing from the Super Nintendo edition of Final Fight for some reason. And to this day, I have no idea what that reason is. But that was my favorite. That was my favorite fighter in the arcade cabinet. That's who I always picked. And I remember when Capcom made the crossover and they put Guy into the first ever Street Fighter Alpha. Oh, I popped. Man. Like, I was just like, oh my God, they got freaking Guy in Street Fighter net. Like, that was like the greatest thing in the world to me when I saw that. Like, that was that. And to this day, Guy has always been one of my favorite fighters in the Street Fighter series as well. And that's dating back to his time from the Final Fight series. But be that as it may, as I was saying, for whatever reason, Guy is not on the SNES version. And that really irked me. It was still a great game. You still had Cody and Hagar, but you could never. I mean, I'm thinking like, okay, is there like a code to unlock Guy? Do you have to go through the game to beat it, to get him? And I figured there was some way that he was available. But there wasn't, unfortunately. There was no code. There was no get through the entire game to unlock Guy. Nothing like that existed. Nothing like that existed. For whatever reason, and I would love to actually hear from anybody who does, leave a comment. And maybe somebody knows why he was omitted from the Super Nintendo version of Final Fight. But that would be my reason of why I would go towards Streets of Rage. And and again, it's still close. Even with the omission of Guy, it's still close. It's still close. But that would be it though. That would be the reason for why I would absolutely go for I would favor Streets of Rage a little bit more. Not to mention the soundtrack of Streets of Rage is absolutely phenomenal. It's phenomenal too. And don't get me wrong, the opening level on Final Fight lives rent free in my head as well. So it's not too shabby in its own right. And they actually use the same theme. I say they, I'm referring to Capcom. Use the same opening thing of Final Fight for Guy's stage on Street Fighter Alpha, which I thought was so freaking cool. I thought that was really, really cool back in the day. But yeah, that would be my pick. That would be my pick. Would be Streets of Rage, just based off of that annoyance from the home console. If we're talking Super Nintendo versus Sega Genesis, and there wasn't that many times, to be honest with you, where Sega Genesis games were superior over Super Nintendo titles, but there were some really big exceptions. And I'm very fond of Sega Genesis. I'm very fond of Super Nintendo. It just so happens that I had a Sega Genesis first. So I'll always back Genesis a tad bit more than Super Nintendo because I had a Genesis approximately 2 years before I got a Super Nintendo. So yeah, Genesis was it, man. Like there's so many classics on that console, not just Streets of Rage. I can name many right now, but I'll leave that to come in so many future videos that I have planned to talk about. There's many, many fond memories. And obviously, even on Super Nintendo, a lot of classics, a lot of fond memories there too. As I reiterate, I owned both systems. They were Christmas gifts, actually, when I was growing up. Like I said, man, I got the Genesis Christmas of 1990. A couple of years later, I got the Super Nintendo. So, but that's going to wrap up today, this video in particular. Again, I would love to hear you guys' feedback on which one do you prefer. Do you prefer Streets of Rage, or do you prefer Final Fight when it comes to between the Sega Genesis Classic and the Super Nintendo Classic? Also, if there's anybody who's watching this video, if you happen to know or have seen a reason, a report of why Guy was left out of the Super Nintendo version of Final Fight, I definitely would like to hear that in the comments.